Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. All right, so here we go. This is our third class on writing the offer. We've gone through, quite a bit of the actual stuff that we have to fill out and move forward. We ended last class talking about sellers remaining in possession after the close of escrow and how to handle tenant or occupants that are not the seller, right? So tenant occupied properties, we use the tenant occupied property addendum. We went through that to finish out last week. Just again, a refresher on that. Please make sure that if the seller is going to remain in possession for any amount of time after the close of escrow, that we're using the proper forms. And if that is 29 days or less, it is the SIP, the seller license to remain in possession. If it is 30 days or more, it is the residential lease after sale. Those are the two forms. Just make sure you're using them. And if it's any amount of time between 1 and 29, that seller license to remain in possession has to be used. Okay, you got to use it. And for every property that is tenant occupied, whether that tenant is remaining in possession when the new owner takes over or they're vacating before or at the close of escrow, you have to include the TOPA, the tenant occupied property addendum. That is required for any tenant occupied property. Okay, so we went through that last week. Any questions before I share my screen? I want to give you guys an opportunity. Now, again, remember, just raise your hand or type it in the chat because I don't have you guys on the ability to unmute yourself. So just let me know if you have something by raising your hand or, there we go. Darwin, go right ahead. Oh, where'd you go, Darwin? You had your hand up and then you disappeared. Go ahead, Darwin.
Boss, I just missed the part, so that's just logging right now. The part where you say tenant occupy, what form it is, or what was? That was my question.
Yeah, the tenant occupied property addendum. It's right here. It's 3M3 is the paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see it. Okay, so you guys should be looking at right now the copy of the purchase agreement, and right here, paragraph 3M3, this is occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. The tenant occupied property addendum must be incorporated. Seller shall disclose if occupied by anyone other than seller and attach TOPA in a counter offer if not part of buyer's offer. So again, remember the stuff that we're talking about here when we're talking about strength of offer is that we want to make sure that we're writing the strongest offer possible. So if we already know, if we've communicated with the listing agent and we know this is the form that needs to be incorporated with the offer. Okay, so TOPA, tenant occupied property addendum, whether it's going to be delivered vacant or with the tenants in possession. Okay, all right. So let's move on. Let's move on to the next section here. So we talked about that. So now we're going to talk about like the documents, fees, things like that, right? The costs that are associated with it and who's paying for what and the timelines that are associated for the seller. So the first one is paragraph 3N1, and that is seller delivery of documents. If you look right here, it says the more information paragraph is 14A, and we'll get to that. In 14A, it will reference back to the paragraphs and documents that the seller is required to provide during this time period. Okay, so 7 days is the default. So you have to keep in mind that those 7 days, even though we look at time periods as like, buyer has 17 days to review, seller has 7 days. It's not 7 plus 10 makes the 17. The 17 is its own thing. The 7 is its own thing, right? The 7 days the seller has to deliver the documents and the 17 days that the buyer has to review all those documents. They're only connected if the seller fails to deliver those documents on time. Okay. So, and we'll get to it later on when we start getting into the details of like explaining the contract. But in the writing of it, it's okay to leave it at 7 days. It's fine. But if you've reduced all of your time periods, and we go back here to the time periods for the seller, right? For the buyer, we've reduced all these time periods. Okay. So 10 days, 12 days, 10 days, 10 days. So review of seller's documents right here is at 10 days. If we then leave this as 7 days, which I'm not suggesting you change, but it's still going to have to be a conversation with your buyer, because if the seller delivers them in 7 days, if by day 7 you have all of the documents, you have to be able to review them and remove that contingency of reviewing them within 10 days, which means 3 days after you receive them, your contingency is going to be up. So you have to understand what those time periods mean. So when we're writing these offers and we're reducing time periods just on our own because we think it's going to improve our offer, which sometimes it does, right? And we talked about that last week about shortening time periods and how that works. But if I'm going to do that, I also have to make sure that my buyer understands what that means for them, which means now I have limited time to review all the documents. Now, if the seller is late, if the seller delivers those documents anytime after day 7, so you get them all on day 8, everything that they're supposed to review, or you've gotten everything prior, but there's one document that they deliver late, they deliver on day 8. Now I have 5 days after the delivery of that document if it exceeds my contingency period time, right? So now we know if I have a 10-day review of disclosures or review of seller's documents, and I get everything on day 8, then the time period, because they're late, is shorter than the amount of time I'm supposed to get per the contract when they're late with their delivery. So I get 5 days from that date. So instead of having 10 days to remove that contingency, I now end up with 13. So I know that sometimes that math gets a little confusing, but as long as they're on time, whatever your contingency period is, you have to live with that contingency period. So if you do something like reduce it to 7 days and don't change their delivery of documents, if they give it to you on day 7, you still have to remove that contingency because they're not late. So you've got to make those adjustments. So my suggestion is, as a listing agent more than anything else, because as a buyer's agent, I have very little control over the ability to change the seller's behavior and how quickly things get done. But if I'm a listing agent and I'm requesting people to reduce their time period to inspect or and to investigate the documents that are the responsibility of my seller, I should be the one telling my seller, hey, by the way, we need these to be delivered to the seller to the buyer much sooner. Something like a 5 days or less, right? If I say 5 days and I've given them 10, then I'm meeting that 5-day window, which is more than enough, right? The contract Sierra believes that 5 days is enough to review all documents. That's fair. So if I'm going to reduce something like reviewing documents to 10 days, then let's review to 5 days the delivery time. And if I'm doing my job as listing agent, chances are I've already got all of those documents done and ready to go prior to accepting an offer, so it shouldn't be an issue. And that would be my suggestion to those of you that are listing agents, is have all of those seller required documents, all the disclosures done, anything that you have to get from a third party that's a requirement for the seller to provide, have that all done prior to opening escrow with any of your offers. That way, if you want to shorten those review of documents time periods, it won't be an issue because you're delivering those documents on day 1. Okay. All right. So you can request, again, we're talking about strength of offer when we're writing. So maybe requesting shortening times for the seller is not the best thing if I'm talking about strength of offer. But as long as my buyer's on board and understands how the time periods work, it would be okay as long as I have enough time to review those things. Okay. This sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions, it's 5 days after the delivery. So whenever they get delivered to the party, and that's both parties, buyer or seller, when they get delivered, you have 5 days to return them back to escrow. So you have 5 days. So keep in mind, if you're a seller or you're a buyer and either party doesn't return those escrow instructions, if you keep track of the time periods and you send notices to perform, that could be a reason why the deal falls apart, right? So if you have a seller that is on you or is getting multiple offers and your buyer is dragging their feet, you guys have to have a conversation with the buyers to make sure that those buyers are on time with what needs to be done, because that could lead to, if they drag their feet, they've got to get those things back on time, because that could lead to a notice of performance and a cancellation if they don't work on that. So it's been part of the contract for the last few years, but it's still a newer item that's listed in the contract about returning the escrow instructions. Okay. The time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents, that's a tough one. I know the contract is saying 3 days after acceptance. That generally is dependent on how fast the money gets into escrow and how fast escrow works. So that's going to be a tough one. I mean, if a buyer really wanted to, because the ordering the HOA documents is technically the seller's responsibility, even though escrow does it and it comes from the funds that the buyer puts in. If those things weren't done and a buyer wanted to get out and cancel escrow, that's something that they could do, right? It's a notice to perform. This one is something more for the listing agents than anybody else. I would leave it alone if I was a buyer's agent. It doesn't matter if they get to 7 days or not. The problem is that if there's an installation that's necessary for smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, or the water heaters embraced properly, and the seller doesn't do it in those first 7 days, right? They don't make sure it's done. When my appraiser goes out and sees those things aren't done, the chances are that the appraiser is going to call those to be a requirement of getting the property to appraise, correct? And if now what the contract says, and we'll get into it later when we get into the description paragraphs of the purchase agreement, if there is a reinspection for the appraisal, contractually the seller is responsible for the cost of that reinspection. Okay. And especially if that reinspection is due to the smoke alarms, the carbon monoxide detectors, or the water heater bracing. So, just as a suggestion, I know this is about writing, but as a suggestion to you that are listing agents that are hearing this and that are on the class, this should be at the time you have the conversation with them about taking the listing. Prior to getting an offer, prior to marketing the property, you should make sure that the smoke detectors, the carbon monoxide detectors, and the water heater bracing is all done, so that you don't have to worry about this 7-day period. Because as long as I have it done, I don't have to worry about this in the first 7 days, because we did it before you even wrote the offer. Okay, so just a suggestion. 3 and 5, evidence of representative authority. So if you have a buyer or a seller that is a representative of an entity, it is a corporation, a partnership, a trust, a probate, they have 3 days after acceptance, both parties do, to provide proof of their authority to the other party. Now, I know that most agents don't stress this, right? Like the listing agents aren't asking you for what you need to show the corporation and that they're an authorized signer on behalf of that entity. I know they don't. I know escrow will require it, and you'll give that all to escrow. But remember, this is 3 days after acceptance. So if you don't provide this, again, it's another way for a seller to say, well, you didn't get it for me, so I've sent you a notice to perform. They want to get out of the sale. They send you a notice to perform. You didn't provide it. They get to cancel, and you have no fight. So if you are a buyer's agent that is having your buyer is an entity, and you're having the representative sign it, get the proof of their authority at the very beginning and send it with your offer. So when you send the RCSD, the representative capacity signature disclosure, if you don't fill this out properly, you have to use that. If you fill this offer out, and we'll get to that much later, go ahead and send with your offer the proof of their authority to sign on behalf, so that there is no question. You don't have to worry about that 3 days after. Everybody is on Everybody's on the same page. And again, strength of offer. I've already given you the stuff I need to provide you from my buyer. We're trying to write the best offer we can. So the more information you can give the listing agent, the better. Okay, any questions on paragraph 3N before I go to the next page? Anybody? Okay, all right, let's go. All right. Again, now we're on to the next page. We're on to page 3. Again, just remember that make sure the dates are going at the top of each one of these pages also. Just make sure that they're there. So here we are with the items included and excluded. Okay, all items specified in paragraph 9B are included and the following if checked. Okay. So 9B is later on. Again, it's the explanation paragraph. So we'll get to that because it starts to break down what fixtures are, what things are that are automatically included, right? So there are items that are going to be part of your home when you sell it that you cannot take without negotiating with the buyer, right? That cannot be removed, that have to move on with the property. And we'll talk about that when we get to that. But if I'm an agent, right? If I'm a buyer's agent and I'm writing an offer and in the MLS somewhere or in my conversations somewhere with the seller or the listing agent, they tell me that the stove, the refrigerator, the washer, the dryer, the microwave, the video doorbell, the wall mounted brackets for the TV, if they tell me those things are staying, then I'm going to include them in my offer. They told me that for a reason. Right? Because what happens is if we don't include it in the offer, right? They're telling us it's included. The reason it's included is they don't want to take it. They don't need that refrigerator anymore. They don't need that washer and dryer. They don't need it. So they're not taking it. And what happens is, and this is just as important for a listing agent as for the buyer's agent, what happens is now these items become personal items if they're not included in the sale, like they're not included in this paragraph in 3P1. And now that could lead to disputes later. So what happens is us as buyer's agents, instead of addressing it specifically, we just leave it out because we think, oh, we don't want it. Well, there's 2 reasons that it doesn't happen. One, we forget to put it in there, even though we knew that it was supposed to be included. Number 2 is the buyer doesn't want it. But instead of having a conversation with the listing agent and say, hey, listen, by the way, like I could put it in my email, I could make a phone call when I'm submitting my offer. Hey, by the way, we left off the stove, washer and dryer, refrigerator, and the microwaves because my buyer doesn't need them. They don't want them to stay in the property. Like you could tell them that ahead of time, because what happens is we avoid that conversation altogether. And then later it becomes a dispute, right? Because the buyer's upset that they have to get rid of these things. And because we didn't have the conversation, even though the listing agent saw the offer that says these things aren't included, they assumed, and so did the seller, that they were still included, and they leave them behind. And then we got problems, right? We've all, like, most of us have been through those issues where a seller moves out and doesn't clean up, doesn't take their stuff, and we have to deal with that after the fact. Let's just hit it head on. If you talk to your buyers and say, hey, by the way, I spoke with the agent, or this is what the MLS states, they're leaving all these things behind. Do you want them? If they say yes, make sure you check the boxes and send the offer in. Okay. So you have to do that if you're including those things. If there's something that's going to be included in the sale that isn't on one of these check marks, you can check the box and type in the item that you're looking for. By default in the contract, the bathroom mirrors are included. And I don't know why, but for some reason, people seem to believe that they could take the mirrors out of their bathroom. Now, I know that some sellers, maybe they buy custom mirrors and they hang them up and they do all the things in the bathroom. You have to have a conversation as a listing agent with your seller. Hey, by the way, that mirror in the bathroom, it has to stay with the property. Make sure you tell them that. Now, you can exclude it here. I can't uncheck it because it's defaulted into the contract, but I could exclude the bathroom mirror here if I wanted to. Now, this section for excluded items, same thing as the included, but the excluded is looking at that list that we'll talk about later in paragraph 9B. It's looking at that list and saying these things that everybody assumes would remain with the property, this is not remaining with the property, and you have to address that. So again, as buyer's agent, in my conversations with the listing agent or whatever's listed on the MLS, if I know specifically that an item is excluded that we may believe to be included normally, I've got to put it in that contract. Again, making my offer stronger because I'm following the information and the directions that the listing agent gave me and what the seller wanted to have happen. So again, I'm putting myself in a position where it's one less thing that the listing agent has to counter me. Because if I don't put those excluded items in, even if I know them, when the offer goes to the listing agent and the listing agent presents it and they decide to counter, then now they have to write a counter. Buyer and seller are aware, or buyer is aware that, chandelier, light fixture, ceiling fan, rose bush is excluded from the sale of property. Okay. So when we get into the items that are included and excluded, like normally and by default per the contract, we'll talk about those items a little bit more and the problems that come with it. But just please remember, if something is excluded, if a ceiling fan is, ceiling fan in dining room, right? If that ceiling fan is excluded, then make sure you do it because you've been told that it's going to be excluded. Okay. Questions about items included, excluded, writing them in. Again, we'll get into way more detail as we get deeper into the contract. But any questions at this point? All right. Perfect. Okay. Now we're looking at allocation of costs. Who pays for what? Okay. That's where we're at right now. So, natural hazard zone disclosure report, including tax information. The advice is probably ask for the environmental issues, ask for environmental to be included in the NHD. This normally is the seller's cost. This is normally something the seller provides. It is not going to weaken or strengthen your offer really by changing it. Now, what I would suggest if you're a listing agent, even if you get from the buyer that the buyer is going to pay for that report and your seller's like, yeah, I'm in. I feel like because this NHD report, this natural hazard zone disclosure report, is a mandated disclosure. It is a disclosure that is required to be provided. You cannot waive it. And it's replacing the disclosure that would come from the seller. So in disclosures, there's a form called the natural hazard disclosure statement, not report. That natural hazard disclosure statement is the required disclosure. And that one is solely filled out by the seller. It's the seller answering the questions about fire zones and earthquakes and all those things. Our sellers don't know that stuff. Excuse me. Our sellers don't know the answers to those questions. So these NHD reports replace that. So this is technically a disclosure from your seller, even though it's provided by a third party. So if the seller isn't paying for it and the buyer is, there could be an argument made that the seller didn't provide that disclosure because they didn't. The buyer did. A third party did. The seller didn't pay for it. My suggestion, and I'm not saying that I've ever heard that that's happened. I just don't like loopholes. So we want to close them up. It's not like these are uber expensive. They're not like commercial when they're doing those, those environmental surveys and things, which are, thousands of dollars. This is $100, 120, 130 bucks, whatever it is. If your seller refuses to pay for it, you just leave it as seller is going to pay for it, and then you credit it. You pay for it out of your commission, or you pay for it out of your pocket. I'm telling you, it's a much better choice than letting the buyer pay for it. So let's leave it at the seller's paying for it, the seller's providing it. That's how it's going to be. So when I'm writing my offer, there's nothing wrong with me asking. It's not weakening my offer by asking, but please make sure. I see so many times where I see offers where agents bring them to me to review, and I've reviewed some of our agents, and I still see this instead of provided by, I still see click here to select your service provider on the offer that they've printed for me to review, or that they're saying, hey, I got this offer. Can you take a look at it for me and make sure there's nothing wrong with it or what we need to counter? So make sure you're checking off the box provided by, and in here, just put seller's choice. Most of the time we know that that's what the counter offer is going to be, is the counter is going to be, it's our services. So just give it to them. Okay. This optional wildfire disclosure report is exactly what it says. It is optional. It is not the fire hardening and the fire hardening and the oh, my mind just went blank on what it's called. The anyway, it's not that. That disclosure is required. The fire hardening disclosure is required if on your NHD report it says the property is in a high or very high fire zone. It is also a disclosure that can be made if the seller chooses to make it, even if this NHD report doesn't say they're in a high fire zone. This is something completely different. This is a very specific, it says like it supposedly narrows down where the fire hazard actually is on the map, instead of it being as broad as just saying, yes, we're in a fire zone because of a zip code or a specific area. This one goes into detail and says this is where those, supposedly this is what it does. I have heard that it may help the insurance costs. I don't know that it will or not. I can't tell you that. You guys would have to ask your insurance people if having that would help with the insurance for a property that may be in a fire zone. But again, it is not a required disclosure. So unless it is something that is really like, that this is going to be an issue, it's something that's super important, you could ask for it. I would always ask if I'm going to ask for it for the seller. But again, it's not required, even if the property is in a high fire zone. Okay. So it's going to be a nothing there. I just think it looks cleaner when it doesn't say click to check your service provider, right? Especially if we're not choosing anything here. These two things are any other report that you may want to request for the seller to pay for and provide. Now, I know that I tell you guys anytime I can, we're talking about strong offers here. Do not request the termite report in your purchase agreement. Okay? Don't do it. I have an inspection period. I can get my own termite inspection done. I can request termite repairs in my request for repairs. I can do that. If I put in here that the seller is going to provide a wood destroying pest report, right? If I put that in here and I put seller, now if the seller accepts that, the lender is going to require a copy of that, and they're going to, 99% of the time they're going to require that, and they're going to require the clearance prior to funding. 99% of the time. Okay. So now what happens is I just added an extra layer of the issues that may pop up for my buyer to get their loan approval and to be able to close escrow. Okay. If I'm going to ask for that, this is just the report. You see, it says report. This has nothing to do with the repairs or clearances or anything like that. It's just who's going to provide a report. So my suggestion is you don't ask for it. Now, if you have a VA buyer, you know that the termite work has to get done. That's different. That has to get done. I'm going to ask for it on VA. On everything else, I'm not requesting it. But if I have to, I want the seller to provide the report, and I want the seller to do the work. The work doesn't go here. The work goes down here. And it doesn't fit in here. So we could put termite, we could put termite clearance in here. You could change this to termite report, right? Everybody knows what we're talking about. But if I do that here, I must go down here and do the same thing. If I'm doing that, okay, if I do that, I have to do that. You can put termite clearance / repairs in here too if you want to make sure that you're getting everything. I need that done, right? So if I'm doing this, I have to do this. But the only reason I would suggest that you guys do that, the only reason would be if you have a VA buyer. If you have any other kind of financing, then do not put this in. Don't check that box. And do not put this and do not check that box. Okay? That's it. That would be my suggestion. And yeah, Jasmine, yes, termite report is okay versus wood destroying pest. But that's what I would tell you. Okay? Questions so far about the reports that we've talked about? Anybody else? No? All right. Okay. So again, optional reports, that's where you go. Who's going to pay for it? Now, what drives me nuts is when I see, and here's the thing. Remember that a lot of buyer's agents are not doing the things that we talk about doing, where they communicate with the listing agent all the way up through, getting the offer accepted, where they're asking questions, right? And you have to, your offer is the only communication you have with the listing agent. So they're making a decision on your buyers based on just what you write. And when I see this professional home inspection or home inspection, whatever they, fits, whatever buyers write, it doesn't matter because you shouldn't put it. When I see this and they have buyer checked on there, I don't know why, but it drives me nuts. The contract already allows for the buyer to do their report. It's already in here. I don't need to tell the buyer they're paying for it. I don't need to tell the seller the buyer's paying for it. That's just, I don't know. It just seems silly to me. So when I see it, it bugs me. So if I was a listing agent and I got it, I would be like, I'd start thinking about, what's the quality of the agent that I'm dealing with on the other side? Okay. So just think about what that looks like. There's no need for it at all. The other thing that I see on here all the time is city pre-sale report, right? And they check off seller here. Again, it's not necessary. There's a section for it that we're going to get to right here that already exists. So when I see that, as if I'm looking at the eyes, like looking through the eyes of listings, I'm thinking, again, this is somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And it makes me question the agent that I'm going to be dealing with for the next 20, 30, 45 days, right? So again, talking about strength of offer, unless there is a very specific report, something that has to do with the condition of the property that is not already referenced somewhere else in the contract, that's the reports that go there. Okay. In the chat, I see somebody put appraisal reports call out termite repairs. They do. Appraisal reports will, but the damage has to be extensive, right? I mean, for most of the time for an appraiser to call it out. And yes, all of that stuff has to be done prior to funding. Okay. Smoke alarms, carbon dioxide detectors, water heater bracing. The seller is responsible for putting that stuff in. It says in the beginning, by default, it's the seller. Just do that. Always check seller. It's not going to change the strength of your offer by saying the seller is going to pay for that stuff. Okay. Now, we talked about these reports here. This section, Q5, Q6, government required point of sale inspections or reports. That's everything. That's Compton, Maywood, Southgate, Linwood, Huntington Park, all of the cities that we know that require a pre-sale inspection where somebody goes out and inspects the property. That's what this is talking about. It's also talking about like the city of LA that doesn't have an inspection, but there is a report, the 9A, that is required for you to offer to get. That's the same thing. Cities like Long Beach, they have a parking report, but it's not an inspection, but it is a government required point of sale report. That's what this is talking about. So any of those things are covered by checking off that the seller is required to do them. Now, the reason that we put the seller is required to do them is because in 99%, 99.9, probably 100%, it is either the seller or the listing agent that has to order that report. The buyer can't even get it. So it's not like the buyer can go to the city and say, hey, I need to order this. They can't do it. It has to be the seller or the listing agent. So the seller is going to be responsible for that. Now, if you as listing agent want to say, seller will order it, pay for it, but buyer's going to then reimburse at close of escrow as part of the closing costs, you could try. But let's be realistic. Come on. The seller is paying for this. The seller needs to provide it. And for those of us that are listing agents that work in these cities that know they have to be provided, start growing a backbone. and telling your sellers that it's something that has to be provided. The amount of offers or counters that I see that state that the buyer is going to agree to waive these pre-sale inspection reports boggles my mind. It's not like these are brand new things. They have been around for years now. And it's not something that we're just learning to deal with, like maybe the practice changes with the compensation. This is something that's been around for years. And if and we as listing agents can't get the courage to talk to our sellers and make sure that our sellers understand that this is a cost of them selling a home, that this has to be provided. Now, can the buyer take responsibility for the repairs that come from that? Absolutely. And that's the next thing. That's Q6. So this is the report. This is the corrective actions that this report is calling for. So again, this is where the buyer's agent is also at fault, because we've had a conversation with the listing agent, or should have, and we've talked to the listing agent about, okay, the property's in Southgate. You guys are prepared to provide the disclosure, the pre-sale inspection. Yes, we are, but we're going to request that the buyer takes responsibility for it. Or maybe they say, well, we don't know, put it in your offer, or whatever's going to happen. If your buyer is reasonable to, or is open to the idea of, we're going to get this report from the seller, but we're going to take responsibility for the repairs after the close of escrow, guess what you could do? You could check buyer right here. And now when they get my offer, they don't have to counter me. I'm telling you, all I want from you guys is the report. My buyer is going to be responsible for the repairs. So if I know that ahead of time from the listing agent or the seller, and I write my offer this way, guess what I just did? I moved my offer up a notch, because it's one less thing they have to counter. And I'm already telling them from day one, we're willing to take responsibility, but you got to give me the report so I know what I'm taking responsibility for. There's been too many times where I've seen buyer's agents and listing agents that are both guilty of the same thing, telling a buyer, you have to be responsible for the report, but we're not going to give you the report, and buyers and sellers closing escrow without that buyer having the report. And then finding out months later that, or years later, when they go to sell the place, that there's thousands of dollars worth of work that needs to be replaced, and they can't now push that off onto the buyer because they failed to do the work the first time that they purchased it. So just be honest with your buyers, be honest with your sellers, make this part of your listing presentation in the cities where these things are required, that the seller knows that they have to do it. And guess what? It takes a long time in most of these cities to get that report. So please don't wait till you get offers accepted. Get that report done ASAP, so that when you do start getting offers, when you do start marketing the property, you can be on time with the delivery of this report, like you're supposed to the first 7 days, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Okay. So if your buyer already knows that they have to take responsibility for any city repairs based on an inspection, then go ahead and check buyer to begin with. If you don't know that, then you check the seller, you ask for it, and let the seller counter you, right? Or if your buyer doesn't have the ability, or they don't believe they have the ability or the means to take care of that, then you ask for it and you get countered. But if you can, this is going to make your offer stronger if your buyer's in that position. Now, I'm not saying convince your buyer to say this. I'm saying have a conversation with your buyer, an honest conversation. Let them know that sometimes these bills can get hefty, and that the seller is going to or we're going to request that the seller provides a report. And then you're going to have the opportunity then to look at what that is. But the seller is not committing to make those repairs for you. Okay. So have that conversation with them. Okay. Escrow fees. It is always each their own fees. Escrow holder, again, seller's choice, right? Seller's choice. We know they're going to counter us. Okay. Just go ahead and do that. Again, it reduces the counter. Now, I know that we've had issues with escrows in the past where, and we've had conversations in the meetings about how, there's some escrows out there that are not, they're not fully bonded, or they're not insured. They don't have, they're not taking care of clients. They're broker owned escrows instead of independent escrows. And there's dangers in those things. if you can negotiate with the listing agent prior to writing your offer about your escrow company and they say they're okay with that, they're open, then go ahead and put the escrow company you prefer to work with. That's fine. But in most cases, it's going to be seller's choice just to keep us from having to go through issues with counters. And Maria in the chat just put up a link where you can check for pre-sale and 9A reports. So there you go. There's a link in there. So go to the chat, copy that link. That way you guys have it. Maricela, go ahead.
Hi, Kyle. A tip that an agent told me for the escrow is that you could put the seller's choice, but they have to be licensed and bonded. So do you think that that's okay in this market to write that?
Well, you can write it, but it still doesn't matter. If I counter it out, it doesn't matter. Like if I tell you this is who escrow is, you could put seller's choice, but must be licensed and bonded. I'm going to tell you, no, this is who the escrow holder is. Once I put that in a counter, it doesn't matter that you put licensed and bonded anymore. So that just putting seller's choice already is really enough. It's tough. Like that's why I'm saying like those conversations about the escrow company are conversations that have to happen prior to the offer, not, hey, by the way, in my offer, I'm telling you how to do your. It's got to be a conversation about, hey, who's your escrow company? Can I do a little due diligence prior to writing the offer? If not, hey, I have another escrow company that I might be able to recommend to you if you guys are open to it because of X, Y, and Z, the things that are happening. We all know about the wire fraud and all that stuff. Those are conversations that happen prior to the offer. I think that if you just put it in an offer like that, like in a vacuum, like you have to do this, I don't think it goes well with the listing agent. But even if you do put that, whatever they counter you and tell you this is going to be the escrow company, that's the escrow company. You then would have to make a decision on whether or not you wanted to move forward with that escrow company.
It's just protecting our clients. It's just making sure that.
Oh, no. I agree with you. We should protect our clients. But ultimately what happens is the listing agent is going to say, hey, we want to use this escrow company, and that's who we're using. If you want the offer, then that's how it's going to be. Then you have to go back to your buyer and say, hey, listen, I don't know anything about this escrow company. This is the escrow company they're telling us that they have to use. What do you want to do? And let the buyer make the decision. And I would tell you that most of the time the buyers are going to be like, I really want the house, so let's go forward. It's going to be the truth. But yes, do everything you can to protect your clients. I agree. Title insurance. This is always the seller. Owner's title insurance policy. It's never both. It shouldn't be the buyer. Now, it could be the buyer. I mean, look, we've talked about trying to make our offer as strong as possible. Let's say that my buyer maybe can't go up in price anymore, but we want to try to reduce some of the costs that the seller's going to incur, right? Increase their net. Let's say that, hey, we'll pay for all of the title, the seller side and the buyer side, because the buyer side, this lender title insurance policy is defaulted to the buyer. You don't change that. But if you wanted to, you could save them, $1,700-$1,800 by saying, I'll pay for the title insurance. You could do that. Now, if I'm going to pay for it, then I'm going to put my title company. I'm going to put whatever your title company is, Stewart or Monarch or whatever title company is that you use, you're going to put Fidelity, you're going to put that in. But if you put Stewart, you're going to put David Sr. If you put, Monarch, you're going to put Ralph. If you put Fidelity, then you're going to put Michelle on there. If you put, Corinthian, whatever, you put John Martinez Jr., you put your title rep's name, because if you don't, and you go to escrow and they just see Fidelity Title, Monarch, Gold Republic, whatever, they just see the title company name, they're going to give it to the rep that they work with. So make sure that if you're asking for whatever company you're asking for, that you put your title rep's name in there. Okay. But only ask for your title if you're the one who's saying, you know what, I'm going to pony up for the title because I'm trying to improve my offer. So if your buyer has the cash to be able to pay extra closing costs, do that. If they don't, then this is the seller's responsibility to make sure that the seller is providing you clear title. That's what this does. It ensures that the title that's being provided to your buyer is clean, and that your buyer is not going to inherit any kind of liens or encumbrances that they didn't know about. And that's what title insurance is for. This one for the buyer's lender insurance, that's if I'm getting a loan, I have to do a title insurance on myself to make sure that the lender isn't putting themselves in a position where they're going to lose out on the money that they lend me to purchase this home because of something I did. That's it. That's what that's for. Okay. The county transfer tax fees, same thing. The norm is it's the seller, and most sellers are okay. They understand that they have to pay it. But if I have the ability to, and the buyer says, hey, I want to help increase your net, like we were talking about with the title, the buyer could pay for that county transfer tax. And the county of LA, county of Orange is $1.10 per thousand. Okay. And I always get confused on the city transfer tax. I know, but I think it's like $4.50, $4.40, something like that. City transfer tax, again, you could do the same thing. But the norm is it's the seller. I'm okay with asking the seller to pay for both of those. Okay. But again, if your buyer has the cash, and those city transfer taxes get high, right? If you're talking about $4.50 per thousand, right? That's a lot of money. So seller, that's the norm. Okay. The HOA fee for prepping the disclosures, it's the seller's responsibility. But remember, those disclosures that come from the HOA, the fee that gets charged for that, the escrow is not going to order it until the money goes in for the deposit. So first it's going to come out of the buyer's deposit money, but the seller will get charged for it as part of their closing costs. Okay. So these are defaulted. These cert fees are defaulted, seller and buyer. The transfer fees, again, are negotiable. Okay. Normally it's the seller, but again, if I'm a buyer and I have the extra cash, I'm trying to improve my position, I could say I would pay for it. Most buyers don't have that kind of money. The norm is it's the seller. Okay. Private transfer fees. This is not something that happens in normal real, like in the resale of a property that's been, that was built in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. There is generally not going to be a private transfer fee. That's more for new developments where a developer built the property and these sellers are the first owners of the property, right? Because it's a brand new home. Sometimes in those contracts, there's a private transfer fee that goes back to the developer. The developer gets paid because the owner of the property transferred the property to somebody else. That by default is the seller. Okay, so I would leave that alone. I wouldn't change it. Okay. Fees or costs. This again, like we talked about with the termite, if I'm asking for the termite, that's where it's going to go. For my buyers, if I am an agent that has my buyer pay for the transaction coordinator, I add that fee in there, then I would put in there transaction coordinator or TC, right? Or whatever it is. And I would put the amount. For us, it's $275. If you're using an outside TC, it's not one that's an employee of the company. I would be careful about asking for these fees. I don't think this is something that, just my opinion, I wouldn't be charging my client for it because a transaction coordinator is really a benefit to the agent. I know it is nice to have communication with, to have somebody that's probably easier to communicate with than maybe the agent could be. I know that's nice for the buyer to have that and have a second person to fall back on. It's just my opinion though. If I was doing it, I would be paying my own TC fee. I wouldn't be charging to the client. But if I am, I'm going to put it right here in the offer because if I put it in the offer, it becomes a closing cost for the buyer and it ensures that the escrow is going to take that out to make sure that the transaction coordinator fee gets paid. Okay. So any other fees you could think of, go ahead and put those in. Home warranty. This is where it amazes me how many issues I see with home warranty. Okay. This is okay to ask for the seller. As a matter of fact, as listing agent, I'm going to always push to my seller. This is something that you should provide. Always provide it because it's going to save you time, money, right? It's going to help you in the long run. You're going to get less of the phone calls of something's wrong with the house. Right? We close escrow. Now there's a problem. I'm calling you or the listing agent and I'm complaining. So if I'm listing agent, I'm always going to want my seller to pay for it. And if I'm the buyer's agent, I'm always going to request the seller pay for it. The cost not to exceed, please know what the cost of the coverages you're asking for, what it is. Because then again, like the same thing as closing costs when we're writing the offer. If I put in here, $900 just to make sure I get everything covered, but I don't put anything over here for additional coverages because this is where the additional coverages would go, right? So this is where we type that. If there's no additional coverage, then this is whatever the minimum is, which is what, like 500 or 475 or whatever the basic is. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look at the schedules. But there's schedules. Every one of your home warranty reps, whether that be like for us in our office, it's Gloria and Rebecca, they have a schedule. They can show you exactly what it's going to cost for what kind of coverage you're going to get. Okay. Whatever that cost is, make sure you put that amount in here and make sure you type all of the coverages, right? With Rebecca, she talks about that crest, right? I don't know what it costs, so I can't put it in, but let's say it's, $800 and it's the crest 13-month coverage or whatever that is that she's talking to you about. If that's what you're going to do, then make sure it's written in there. If you're not, if you're just asking for the minimum, right, the basic coverage, well, there you go. There's the basic coverage. When you choose your issued by, don't just put the company again. Put in your rep's name. Because again, if they say, yeah, fine, we're going to use your home warranty because you're the one that's going to use it. If you don't do that and you use an outside escrow, they're not going to give credit to your rep. They're just going to use whatever their rep is. So please make sure that whenever you're picking title companies or whatever the case, or any of the providers like this, that you put the name of the rep. Now, as a listing agent, I probably don't have to do that because my escrow company that I'm going to use is going to use my title and my other service providers. I don't need to necessarily put that into a counteroffer, and I don't have to put it into a counteroffer if I've already got an offer that says seller's choice. So you can reduce the amount of things that you have to counter. Okay. That's just make sure that you have the names, that you have the right costs, that you have all of the coverages that you're asking for to cover that. That's how you write it. Okay. Other terms could be anything like subject to interior inspection, right? Well, before I do this, any questions about these costs that we went through? Because I went through all of them. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Other terms. So I know there's some confusion about subject to interior inspection. Oh, Jasmine has a question. Go ahead, Jasmine.
Hi, Kyle. Can you just elaborate a little bit on the buyer HOA certificate, so maybe some of the new agents can understand why what that certificate stands for and how it affects a buyer's loan? I know there's a lot of agents.
And I'm not a lender, but that certification fee is to get the property certified so that it qualifies for their financing for FHA, even for conventional, right? That's to make sure that the property qualifies. And there's a whole laundry list of items that keep it from qualifying, whether they don't have enough money in their reserves, that they haven't. They don't. I think I even recently had one where the lender was upset because they didn't have notes for the meeting for the last 12 months, right? The minutes. That was stopping the property from qualifying. So yeah, and the reason why it's the buyer's responsibility is because it's to get the property clear for financing. But yeah, that stuff is that's gotta be things you gotta jump on right away. And Jasmine being a lender also, I'm sure she's run into those issues many times. So it's important that you guys understand that. And I think also too, as listing agents, one of the things that we have to do is we have to especially going back to this, if we're selling a condo or a townhouse or a PUD, whatever it is, we should do the due diligence at least to find out if it qualifies FHA, so that we don't advertise it to people who are FHA and we don't accept offers that are FHA. If that's the case, we got to know who we're marketing to, because what happens is we've had it a couple of times where these properties are going in and out of escrow, and it's frustrating for everybody. So I would do that as a listing agent. I would do that due diligence from the beginning. Okay. Other terms, and then we're going to finish here. Other terms. Anything else that I need to let the seller know? So it could be something like subject to interior inspection. And I was going to talk about subject to interior inspection because I think there's a big misconception about how that works. So when you write an offer subject to interior inspection, it's not just, hey, we get an offer. And this is for listing agents too, and for buyer's agents. So you guys know how it works, because I've seen so many listing agents that don't handle this the right way. They collect a bunch of offers that are subject to interior inspection. And then they don't accept one, they don't counter one, they don't present them, they don't do anything. They just get one day where everybody who wrote that subject to interior inspection offer comes in and looks at the property. Okay. And then they negotiate, right? Then they counter or accept one or whatever the case is. That's not how subject to interior inspection works. Subject to interior inspection works. If I submit you an offer that's subject to interior inspection, you should be presenting my offer to the seller, countering the terms, get the terms that you want, get the terms that the buyer wants, everybody accepts. And then once the offer is accepted, then you schedule a time for the buyer to go into the property, do an interior inspection, see if the property meets the criteria that they thought it may have had when they made the offer. And if they don't, then you cancel the offer. That's how subject to interior inspection works. It's not an application for a showing. That's not what it is. And I've seen so many listing agents do it, and that's what buyer's agents believe it is. They'll send an offer subject to interior inspection, and they're like, they're still not letting me see the property. They're going to either accept, they should be negotiating your offer with you prior to showing you the property. And if you get acceptance, then you're accepted. And that's how it works. That's what subject to interior inspection, that's how it works. Other things that might go in other terms. The fact that you have to disclose that you're related to the buyer. The fact that you yourself may be the buyer. That the entity that is purchasing the property, that you're represented, that you are an officer of that corporation, that you have a, that you have a stake in that corporation. Anything where you are either related to or part of the person purchasing the property and representing them, you've got to disclose that and disclose that you're licensed and that you work with this company. Okay. That's something that you have to do. So that's where that would go. When people are talking about that, that's where that would go. Okay. So we'll finish there for today. And probably next week will be our last class on this, because we'll go through the explanation paragraphs fairly quickly with some things. But again, this was about writing. So there's just a couple other things that I want to discuss with you guys, and we'll finish that next Thursday. Any questions before I let you guys go? No? All right, good. Thank you for being here. This will be on YouTube later today. If you missed any of it, remember, share these videos, like them. Hopefully you guys get a lot out of them. I really appreciate you spending your hour with me. Take care of yourselves and be productive.